Hey guys, we got chapter 7, hammering out a federal republic. We're going to be looking at the first two presidents of these United States and look at the domestic issues that they had to face with first, and then we'll look at the foreign issues that they had to deal with as presidents. Let's start off with George Washington. As the first president of the United States, he had to set up a functioning government, and George Washington does exactly that. He is the president, so he's the head of the national government, and he elects three different people to be his advisors. He elects Thomas Jefferson to advise him in the Secretary of State, issues that had to do within the country and things that had to do outside the country. Alexander Hamilton becomes the Secretary of Treasury. He deals with finances and running a government through finances. And Henry Knox, he is the War Department head, so he deals with issues that have to do with war and conflict. So one of the major successes of George Washington is to set up a functioning government with the new Constitution and show that the new Constitution was a productive piece of legislation that was implemented. Right after that, we also have the Bill of Rights. Remember, the Anti-Federalists wanted a Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. There's 27 amendments on the Constitution. A lot of you guys know the First Amendment, freedom of speech. But here are some of the other ones. Second Amendment has to do with the right to bear arms. Third Amendment, you don't have to quarter anybody, house anybody. The Fourth Amendment allows you for a search or warrant to be used if they're going to search your property. The Fifth Amendment has several clauses, but the most common one is when people say, I pledge the Fifth, means that they don't have to say anything to incriminate themselves. A couple other ones. The Eighth Amendment protects you from cruel and unusual punishment. The Ninth Amendment says that people have rights beyond those listed in the Constitution. And the 10th Amendment says that states have rights beyond those listed in the Constitution. So again, a functioning government. Congress then sets up the Judiciary Act of 1789. Make sure you know this a little bit. So Congress establishes the Judiciary Act. It allows for the Supreme Court to be established, Courts of Appeal, and Circuit Court. It actually works from bottom to top. So if you go to a court and you don't like their decision, you could appeal to the Courts of Appeal. And if you still don't like their decisions, then you could appeal to the Supreme Court, which is the highest court of the land. And according to the Judiciary Act of 1789, the Supreme Court gets its powers from Congress. And we'll see how this plays out as a conflict a little bit later. After the American Revolution, the United States is in a debt, the way that Britain was after the French and Indian War. So Alexander Hamilton comes up with his financial plan. He comes up with three different plans. First of all, public credit. Second, the national bank. And third, tariffs. So public credit, the purpose of it is to establish trust in economic partners in foreign countries. Basically, this is what it is. Hamilton says that Congress should have a redemption plan, which means all those countries that lend the United States money during the war, the United States should pay them back at face value. Whatever the country loaned them, the United States need to pay back in full. The second plan is the assumption plan. This says that states who still had a debt owed to the federal government or other states, Congress is supposed to pay off the debt. Now there was one or two states who had already paid off the debt that they borrowed from other people or other countries, and those states were going to get reimbursed. The redemption plan and assumption plan allow for the United States to show that they're able to pay off whatever they borrow. That's public credit, and establish a good functioning, trusting government with foreign countries. The National Bank. The National Bank is literally a bank that is established that is going to be run by private citizens, but also by the national government. The purpose of the bank is to make loans, issue bills of credit or loans, and handle government funds. In other words, the money that was coming in, the federal government was going to use it for the good of the people. Now, it becomes a problem, a form of conflict between Hamilton and Jefferson. Jefferson believes that the federal government does not have the power to establish a national bank, but Hamilton uses the necessary and proper clause, which stipulates that the national government has any power that are needed to establish a functioning government, and he uses the necessary and proper clause. The last plan is the tariffs plan. Hamilton says that taxes should be imposed on luxury items like whiskey that is not an essential for survival. And that money was then going to be used to pay off the debt. Now, right off the top, we have a conflict. The Whiskey Rebellion. These are Western Pennsylvania farmers who make extra money by selling whiskey. And they did not want to pay those tariffs that Hamilton proposed. So, they rebel. There's a civil insurrection in Pennsylvania, and George Washington is put to the test. And this is a very famous picture that shows George Washington commanding the army, an organized army that shows the strength of a national government. Eventually, a force of 12,000 soldiers put down the rebellion. The perpetrators are arrested and they're actually convicted. But Washington pardons the culprits, showing his generosity or his mercy upon the people. He understood why they rebelled, but he also wanted to make people understand that a national government was going to function better than a state government. In 1794, we have another battle, another conflict. This is a conflict with Native Americans in the Northwest. Little Turtle, who is the leader of the Miami tribe, he attacks settlers because he feels that these settlers are coming in, taking their land, taking their culture, taking what belongs to them. So thousands of Americans had migrated to the native lands, and the natives go on the attack. Now, twice the Native Americans defeat the U.S. Army until George Washington regroups and sends General Anthony Wayne. He's actually known as General Mad Anthony Wayne. He crushes the Native Americans in the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. And unfortunately for the Native Americans, they're forced to sign a treaty, the Treaty of Greenville, and they're forced to surrender all this land in purple to the federal government. And of course, thousands of Americans rush into there. The Native Americans are then given $20,000 right off the top, and the federal government promised them $10,000 annually for the land loss forever. And that doesn't happen, unfortunately. So that was domestic issues. Let's look at foreign issues. In 1793, France and Britain are at war with each other yet again. Now, these two countries don't have enough men to fight a war. So what they do is they practice impressment. Impressment is when British sailors stop American ships and force the Americans to board the British ships and fight on behalf of the British. Now, the British were doing it, but also the French were doing it. As you would imagine, a lot of Americans were not happy with this. So George Washington needs to address this issue. And he does so by sending John Jay. And John Jay goes over to Britain and establishes what becomes known as Jay's Treaty in 1794. So Jay's Treaty is a treaty between the U.S. and Britain. And what comes out of it is that Britain had the right to stop neutral ships because they were afraid that some of these ships were going to be aiding France. So they wanted to make sure that these neutral ships were in honesty and respect neutral. In addition to that, Britain also promised to remove their soldiers that were stationed in the Northwest Territory. This was something that Britain was supposed to do when they signed the Peace Treaty of Paris, ending the American Revolution. But soldiers still remained there 10 years later. So Britain promised to remove those troops. In exchange, the Americans were to pay pre-war debts to British merchants that they hadn't paid. So this is Jay's Treaty. A lot of Americans didn't like it because they felt that the Americans got the short end of it. Now, keep in mind that part of the reason why Jay went to Britain was because of impressment. And the treaty, Jay's Treaty, didn't say anything about Britain stopping the impressments. So unfortunately, impressment continued. Now, the next treaty that you see here is Picnics Treaty. This treaty was done between the U.S. and Spain. What happens is Spain freaks out when they learn that the United States and Britain form a treaty. And Spain is freaking out that the U.S. and Britain are going to form an alliance and attack Spanish territory in the U.S., which is right here. So Picnics Treaty is pretty much Spain allows American farmers in the West to use the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans to ship their goods out to the rest of the world. And that's what these Western farmers had been calling for. So let's go back to this map. This is the Mississippi River here, and it ends in the port of New Orleans. Spain had full control of the Mississippi River. You had some farmers right around here from the US who wanted to use the river to be able to make profit, but Spain would charge them a fee in order to use the Mississippi River. So Picnic Treaty gets rid of that fee, and now these American farmers are able to use the Mississippi River for free in the port of New Orleans for free and make more profit. This establishing friendly relationships between the Spanish and the US. And notice Spain also has this territory, which is part of Florida and the Panhandle here. So we'll come back to that. So that was 1795. In 1796, George Washington decides that he's no longer going to run for president. He served 2 terms and he's done as president. So he establishes his farewell address. In his farewell address, he warned of 2 things. He warned the U.S. to stay away from European affairs. And second, he warned that political parties were going to divide the U.S. And he started seeing it because Hamilton and Jefferson were not getting along, and factions or political parties started to emerge. So once he leaves office, President John Adams becomes president. John Adams is a Federalist. He passes the Naturalization Act in 1790, which expanded the residency from 5 to 14 years for people who are here illegally. They needed to wait 14 years to be able to vote. This actually was done under President George Washington, but President Adams continues to it. Adams then passes the Alien Act in 1798, which allows the deportation of foreigners and anybody that the president considers an enemy. And then the Sedition Act also passed in the same year, 1798, which is punishing citizens for criticizing the government. This goes completely against the First Amendment, and a lot of people don't like it. But the reason it was passed is because a lot of Republicans, which was the party that Jefferson was the head of, were criticizing the Federalists and President John Adams. So this is why they passed the Sedition Act. In essence, the Sedition Act was against freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and everything that the United States had fought for. So this political cartoon kind of shows you the Sedition Act being a venomous snake that was threatening these American principles. Now, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison do not like these 2 laws, the Alien and Sedition Act. So they passed what becomes known as the Kentucky and Virginia Resolution. In these 2 states, the state of Kentucky and Virginia, they passed a law in the state that says that the Alien and Sedition Acts are voided in those 2 states. So those states are not going to follow this federal law. This is powerful but dangerous. States now have the power to declare a federal law unconstitutional. So if a state doesn't like what the federal government is doing, they cannot follow it. It sets the precedents for future conflicts within the U.S., but it starts with the Kentucky and Virginia Resolution. Let's look at some foreign affairs that President Adams needed to deal with. First of all, we have the Haitian Revolution, which actually started in 1790s. Haiti wanted to free themselves because it was run by white French ministers, but most of the population were black people, either enslaved or free. During Washington's term, Washington actually aided the free whites. When Adams comes to power, he decides to aid the black community, those who are free and those who are enslaved. Haiti eventually kicks out the French from Haiti and establishes the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere. And here you see the hatred of the Haitians towards the French and hanging them. So Haiti becomes a republic in 1803, but it does have a lot of implications in the U.S. because some of these slaves that rebel actually move over to the U.S., and a lot of the whites, a lot of slave masters are afraid that these free Haitian slaves are going to promote an insurrection in the U.S. The other major conflict that Adams has to deal with is the XYZ affair in 1797. So basically what it is, we talked earlier that the French were impressing American sailors. So 3 U.S. diplomats are sent over to France to deal with the French impressment of the U.S. sailor. Upon their arrival, the French representatives asked for a bribe to negotiate and a loan of $250,000 with no promise of a resolution. Americans felt insulted and asked for war against France. And what happens is there is an undeclared war against France in the West Indies, but it also establishes an uneasy relationship between the U.S. and France.